Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories, straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bump in the night. On tonight's episode, a woman on a vacation with her husband finds herself kidnapped. So, what would you do if you were taken from a hotel to be eaten?
Back in early August of last year, my husband Warren and I went on vacation. We were going to do the tourist thing in one of the South's larger cities, but our trip was off to a rough start. We got stuck in baggage check-in for 2 hours. The self-check-in machines couldn't read our passports. When we finally got through, we got stuck in the security checkpoint and had to go through all our luggage. Because of all this, we missed our flight, and in turn, our connecting flight and a hotel transfer. We weren't pleased. After rebooking, we ended up with a total of 7 hours in delays before we got to the hotel somewhere around 11 in the evening. At that point, it turned out we'd been double booked. They were full. I was about to explode while Quarren looked ready to sink through the floor. Luckily, the hotel had a second location downtown. It was more modern, a bit more expensive, and overall nicer. As a courtesy for their mistake, we got a replacement suite. An upgrade. Finally, some good luck, right? Right. We took an Uber there. The place was practically brand new. They had this electronic system where you didn't get a key. You got a personalized code that worked on every door. Quarren handled the codes while I signed us in. There was a 24/7 bodega with organic snacks, wine, and drinks right by the lobby. A sushi restaurant that closed at 11. A sauna, a gym, an indoor pool, and a whole bunch of complimentary things. A couple of free robes to bring home, and a bottle of white wine with a little "for your inconvenience" note attached. While Quarren took a shower, I ordered us some food and unpacked. We'd been traveling all day, and all nearby restaurants were closed. As instructed, I included the code for the outer doors so they could drop the bag off by our door. We got our late dinner by the time I was halfway through a shower. Quarren delightedly shared how he was going to town on our order. Apparently, it was so good and barely any left. Bastard. They had included 2 extra orders of tiramisu as a little treat, but I couldn't eat it. It had coconut in it, my one allergy. All in all, that night turned out pretty good. We shared a lukewarm meal, watched The Office, and went to bed. We talked a bit about our plans for the next day, picking one thing each from our prep list. A tour of the local distillery, a museum trip, dinner at a steakhouse. The good stuff. So after a long day, we called it a night. But that's where the story starts. At 3 a.m., that same night, when someone opened our door. See, one thing I hadn't realized was that the code for the outside door was the same as for our room. It was a single personal code system. Quarren had been the one dealing with it, and I hadn't thought too much about it. But what I'd accidentally done when ordering food was to essentially hand a stranger a key to our room. And that stranger was coming through the door. I tried to shake Quarren awake, but he didn't react. He was completely out, to a point that it worried me. I could smell something sour on his breath. My mind wandered back to the order we'd gotten, and that extra portion of tiramisu. I hadn't had any, so he had chowed down on both. What if it had been laced with something? The door hinges creaked, and I didn't know what to do. I'm 5 feet 3 inches, unarmed, and in my underwear. I decided on a whim to pretend to sleep. If they were just there to steal, at least I'd be unharmed. They were expecting us to be asleep, so as long as I played along, I should be fine. I held Quarren, closed my eyes, and waited. Careful footsteps made their way across the hotel carpet. The door closed. A slow pacing back and forth next to our bed. I counted at least 2 people, maybe 3. Someone could have stayed by the door.
Just the guy.
A man whispered.
Bag him.
They were unwrapping plastic. They weren't in a rush. I could tell they'd done it before. They were quick about it. I held on to Quarren, debating in the back of my head what the hell I was supposed to do. I was leaning towards waiting for them to leave the room and then immediately run outside and get help. Something shifted. One of the intruders made a hushing noise and waved the other one over.
What?
One of them whispered.
There.
Another answered.
The spoon.
Since Quarren was the only one who'd had the tiramisu, one of the spoons were left unused. Only one of us had taken the bait. They knew one of us was awake. In the next breath, I was grappled. A hand covered my mouth and another my throat. I was pulled out of bed before I even realized I was struggling. I opened my eyes to 3 dark figures. They were speaking over one another in a moment of panic. One of them saying they were screwed, another saying they should just go, and a third reminding them that they had no choice but to bring me. I got a gun pressed to the back of my neck.
One word, and you're done. Then we get him. Understand?
I did. I stayed quiet. I couldn't bear the thought of Quarren waking up without me, but what choice did I have?
Get dressed.
They demanded.
Now!
They brought me through the staff area, past the laundry room. There was only a skeleton crew working the hotel at night, and most of them were in the reception area. These 3 could walk me out the back like it was nothing. Right outside, they had an inconspicuous sedan marked with a fast food delivery service logo. They were still talking as they put me into the back seat. They had to improvise a bit. They were supposed to take Quarren, and he was supposed to be out cold. I was wide awake, trying my best to memorize details about the intruders and their vehicle. One of them took off his belt and tied it around my head as a makeshift blindfold. They couldn't drive around with masks on. That'd get them pulled over. They tried to camouflage my blindfold a bit with a trucker hat, and at a glance, you'd be excused for missing that it was a kidnapping.
Why'd you want to bring the guy?
One of them asked.
Less hair gets stuck in the drain.
The other mumbled.
More meat.
Sitting in the back of that car was surreal. All the familiar sounds of a calm drive. Braking, accelerating, the clicking of turn signals. But all the while I felt the barrel of a gun poking into my side, right next to my heart. We were going pretty far out. There was at least a 40-minute ride, and we passed through a tunnel at some point. We must have used the highway. There were a lot of cars passing us. Then we went off-road. The road got rougher, and the sound of other cars faded. As we came to a stop, they all drew a collective sigh of relief.
Out. Now.
They put their masks back on and took off my belt blindfold. I only caught a brief glimpse of the outside area before they shoved me through the door. It was this large old industrial site, probably abandoned. There was a chain-linked fence lining the property. There were no lights on the outside, but the place had power. Stepping inside, the temperature dropped. Somewhere nearby, there were these large fans, creating a powerful draft that swept through the building. I couldn't see them, but even from the hallway, I could hear them. The place was close to freezing. I'd just thrown on my pants, a shirt, and shoes. I didn't even have socks on. One of the attackers went ahead while the other 2 stayed behind. We were in this long corridor with one door at each end, one leading outside and one leading further in. We stood there for a couple of minutes while I heard raised voices in the room up ahead. Those who stayed with me didn't say a word. They just looked straight ahead, keeping a gun aimed at me. Not a word. The door at the other end opened. The 3rd attacker returned, now in the company of what looked like a woman. She had sunglasses and a white face mask and was dressed in what can best be described as dollar store doctor's scrubs. She seemed upset and was scolding the man in a foreign language. Not sure about the origin, possibly Southeast Asian. One of the 2 men holding me seemed frustrated. He grunted.
Hey,
He said.
what's the word?
I don't know.
The doctor woman groaned.
We always pick the man. So,
She scoffed.
could affect harvest. I don't know. Hormones.
She smacked something into the hands of the man next to her and turned to leave.
Prep her.
She called out as she hurried through the doors.
We try.
I was dragged into a big, open space. It looked like an old warehouse. The doctor was nowhere to be seen. She must have gone ahead. There were doors all over, and I was taken into what looked like a shower room. They proceeded to hold me down and shave my head, these long tufts of brown hair sinking into the drain. I hadn't had short hair since I was a kid. I felt naked. It just took them a couple of seconds. They were fast, practiced. They lead me to a pair of double doors. One of them checked a digital watch. Another opened and tested a padlock. There was a collection of buckets next to the door, stained by something thick and blue.
Time.
4:10?
4:10 or 4:11?
4:10.
Check.
They made a note on a piece of paper taped to the wall.
Should we tape her?
Doesn't matter.
The one with the padlock said matter-of-factly.
Been weeks. He's hungry.
And that was it. The doors swung open, and I was pushed inside. The doors slammed shut behind me, and I was on my own. The padlock clicked, and the chains tightened. I just stood there for a moment, not even beginning to understand what was going on. After a couple of minutes, I snapped out of it. I wasn't immediately dead, so there was time to map the space I'd been thrown in. I was in a corridor branching off in 3 different directions. I got the impression that this was built recently. The corridor was no wider than 8 feet and had been wallpapered. Even the ceiling. It had an uncomfortable swirling pattern, a combination of white, brown, and purple. I'd never seen anything like it before. The ground was covered in a thick gray carpet. There were small fluorescent lights above, giving off this eerie illusion that the pattern on the walls were coming out. Somewhere off in the distance, there was a rhythmic thumping. It was getting closer. Heavy footsteps approaching. I picked a direction and made a run for it. If you've never been chased by a predator, it is impossible to describe how it feels. It is, in a literal sense, dehumanizing. It makes you feel like less of a person. You become an animal, a thing, prey. You have to look at yourself and what you are, and what you can do in a completely new light. It forces you to come to terms with the most honest, primal version of yourself. It is horrifying. It brought to light how long it had been since I ran, and how impractical my shoes were. I ended up kicking them off, barely stopping. I went down one corridor, then another, then another. I rushed past a small room with what looked like a pile of pillows in the middle. It stunk of ammonia, so I decided to take another route. It was getting harder and harder to tell where that rhythmic thumping was coming from, and it felt like I was about run into something at every turn. Then I rounded a corner and saw someone. 2 people, a man and a woman, both dressed in bright blue wool-like turtlenecks. They had their arms firmly at their sides and stood shoulder to shoulder in a very unnatural and rigid manner. Like 2 kids trying to hide something behind their backs. I stopped. For a moment, I thought I wasn't the only one locked in there. That maybe, just maybe, there were others. Maybe we could work together? Then I realized that the thumping had stopped. The moment I saw these 2, it was as if whatever was chasing me had stopped. The 2 of them lurched forward. It wasn't a step. It was like 2 mannequins being pushed. I turned to run as the thumping resumed. This time right behind me, I ran screaming. All your senses go into hyperfocus, and you get 100 thoughts running through your head at once. Whatever minute detail your eye accidentally latch onto is burned into your mind. To this day, I can recall the little things I noticed as I sprinted down the hall. Scratch marks breaking the pattern on the wallpaper, stains on the carpet, dark spatter on the ceiling. I ended up back at the room with the pillows. I decided to hide. Hurrying in, I realized it wasn't just a pillow room. This was some sort of lair. There was debris, branches, leaves, flowers, dirt. I dove right in and covered myself with as much as possible, ignoring the smell. I only had a couple of seconds. I was so panicked that I almost swallowed a flower petal. Some kind of dry blue sunflower. I held my breath and hoped. The thumping grew closer. Then it slowed to a tip-tap, clicking. From where I was hiding, I could barely see anything. I could kind of see the edge of a turtleneck sweater. Then something shifted. Now, I only saw the silhouette. But what I saw it didn't make sense. It was those two people I'd seen, but they were sort of moving. Their arms twisted in an unnatural angle, looking more like insect mandibles. Their heads bobbed back and forth like some kind of growth or tail. Their chests vibrated and stretched as they slowly came undone. They weren't two people. They were a single thing, pretending. Seconds later, something grabbed my leg. I was pulled out of the nest and dragged away at a violent speed. I flopped back and forth, slamming into the walls with every sharp turn. I broke 2 fingers by the second turn. I couldn't turn to see what had grabbed me, so I just tried to hold on to something. Anything. The carpet, the wallpaper, the walls, whatever I could. But the force was just too strong. There was no way. Then it stopped. I rolled over onto my back and came face to face with my attacker. And I didn't understand. To this day, I have a hard time describing it. There were so many moving parts. Segmented muscles, like living steel wires. Mandibles and a beak-like mouth. Patches of bright blue hair covering 4 extremities and part of a thorax. A pulsating abdomen. Something warm dripped onto my leg. Drool, perhaps, or a mild acid. It had the same color as the stains in the buckets I'd seen by the door leading into this place. It was a strange blue, and for some reason, that detail just sort of stuck. There were so many little movements at once, and I couldn't even get the scope of how big it really was. It seemed bigger than me, but it could just have long limbs. I couldn't make sense of it. It seemed insectoid, but its movement seemed calculated and intelligent. Then, pain. A bright, burning pain. I mentally blacked out. I flailed, spasmed, and kicked. It had me by the leg, and something sharp had pierced my thigh, picking at my flesh. I could feel my muscle pulling away from me. It was going to snap. I've never felt so vulnerable and exposed. To feel so mortal. It scars you in ways you can't understand, unless you've been there. Then it pulled back, letting me go. Mandibles moved, clicking, hissing. I'd never seen anything like this thing before, but I understood it. It was such a human motion, in a way. It didn't like me. I tasted bad. And that made it angry. It disappeared down the corridor. I just lay there, panting. I didn't even attempt to move. I knew it would hurt like nothing else had. A couple of minutes passed, I think. Maybe an hour. It was impossible to tell. In the distance, I could hear the rattle of the padlock. Perhaps my captors had heard my screams and figured that thing was done with me. Either way, they were coming in. But the moment I heard the door open, things took a sudden turn. Screams and shrieks, gunfire, thumping, popping, clicking, screeching. There was this one noise like a large rubber band snapping in two as a scream suddenly stopped. Panicked voices growing more distant. I sat up and used my arms and one good leg to scooch away. It took a long time, but it was the only way I could move. I didn't dare to look at my thigh, but I could tell it was bad. At least a 2-inch gash. I figured it hadn't hit an artery at least, or I would be dead already. The moment I could see the double doors, I realized something had gone very wrong. The door was covered in a massive splotch of blood, still dripping. Scooching my way out the door, I saw the aftermath of something. The floor was covered in blood and viscera, some which was still moving. I couldn't tell where one person began and the other ended. My hands got slippery as I scooched down the hall, inch by inch. There was still the occasional scream. Someone was being chased. Making my way through that room was a living nightmare. Every now and then I'd recognize something human, like a hand or piece of a leg. I just pushed through. I was doing the movement out of habit at that point. I couldn't have stopped even if I wanted to. A final scream came to a stop. All that was left was the sound of dripping, and me dragging my wounded leg across the floor. In the long corridor leading outside, I found a pile of torn fabric. I didn't didn't want to look at it, but I could see a bit of denim in there. I recalled one of my attackers wearing jeans and decided to take a gamble. I had to feel my way through something I'm not even going to attempt to describe, but I found car keys. As I made my way outside, I managed to prop myself up against the door and limp. Something must have hit a nerve. I had trouble moving my foot. It didn't even hurt. It just didn't work properly. I made it all the way to their car. My hands were pale white from blood loss, and I couldn't stop shaking. Looking back, there was no trace of the thing they'd kept in there. I got in, locked the doors, and took a deep breath. Looking back, I noticed something by the entrance. The doctor. She was coming out of the building dripping with unspeakables. She seemed unharmed, but must have been in the thick of it. She could barely stand and seemed just haunted. An empty gun dropped from her hand. She looked my way, briefly, and then just wandered off. The word that comes to mind was defeated. Blank. I looked down for a second as I put the car in reverse. Looking back up, I saw that thing. It was standing by the entrance, again looking like two people in blue turtlenecks, stained with red. It looked my way, as if considering whether or not to allow me to leave. For a brief moment, it was quiet. We just looked at one another. Then it just closed the doors and retreated back inside. I managed to make it to a gas station. The owner called the police, and the rest is history. I don't think a lot of people read the articles about this. It was deemed as a drug-related gang thing, as the people involved were producing illicit substances. While I agree with this description to a point, I find it wildly misleading. Yes, that thing produced something. But what it was and what it was used for? God knows. I've talked to Quarren about this 1,000 times, but it's impossible to make others see and understand what happened that night. It was just a couple of hours, all in all, but it completely turned my life around for the worse. To this day, my one foot is a lot duller than the other, and I always double and triple check my locks. I made a lot of mistakes that night. I didn't know how the hotel codes worked. Maybe I didn't fight enough when they brought me outside. Maybe it was stupid trying to hide. Maybe this whole thing boils down to me having the worst luck in the world to encounter this, and the greatest luck in the world to survive it. Quarren claims I have some kind of PTSD. I don't think he's wrong, but I don't think that tells the whole story. See, sometimes I see these people in the distance that just looks off. Two people standing in a peculiar pose. One person and two kids standing deep inside an alley, only to be gone the next time you look. I'm sure some of it is just trauma creeping back to the surface. I'm sure it is, but not all of it.
Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a man working as private security gets a job that scars him for life. So, no matter what you do, don't visit the Blue Roses and the Old Man.
I lost my job at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. I've worked in private security for years, mostly covering concerts, parades, and the occasional charity event. Needless to say, there wasn't much of any of that in 2020, so I was axed. I had a few backups lined up, but it just didn't pan out. No one was hiring, there was no opportunity for retraining. I could get started on a new education with my savings, but I figured I'd get a chance to come back to work within a few months anyway. Things took a turn for the worse when my mother was diagnosed with bone cancer. Suddenly, my plan to just sit this pandemic out got turned on its head. She needed all the help she could get, and my savings just wouldn't cover it. I needed at least a part-time job to make ends meet, something that gave me time to stay at home and take care of her. While my mom got worse, I spent most of my days at the doctor's office. They had to schedule her for surgery immediately, along with a chemo and physical therapy. I never got a good idea of how bad it was. They wouldn't even say 50-50. Then one day, while I was reading the classifieds, Yeah, I was getting desperate. A woman approached me. She was in her early 50s, had a very business-like demeanor and short, blonde hair. She made a terrible first impression, looking like she wanted to rip the paper out of my hands and scold me. But that all fell away the instant she smiled at me. All she had to do was flash those pearly whites, and I could suddenly imagine her standing on a porch with a tray of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies.
Excuse me. I couldn't help noticing you were looking through the classifieds.
She smiled.
Do you mind me asking what line of work you're in?
No, of course, I nodded. Private security, ma'am.
Please, Leslie.
She chuckled. She held out a hand, but pulled it back. No handshakes in the pandemic. It was bad enough that she wasn't wearing a mask. Leslie Bolin? I asked. Councilwoman Leslie Bolin?
That's right.
She said, sitting down on a chair across from me.
And you are?
Emmett Marcus, I said. I worked security for many of Councilman Erling's events.
Erling? Then you must have a lot of experience.
I do. She glanced back down at the classifieds, then back up at me.
Erling was quite the character.
She said,
I bet you have some stories to tell.
Not about my clients, ma'am. Leslie gave me a long look. I wasn't flinching. You never talk shit about your clients.
Are you looking for a job, Emmett?
It all looked great on paper. It was part-time, but almost paid a full salary. Some flexible hours during the weekdays. The weekends would be booked solid. I was told there'd be a lot of downtime, and that I was merely a precaution. The only thing that worried me was that I wasn't given a precise location or even instruction. Two things were clear. I was to bring my own gun, and Councilwoman Bolin wasn't the one in need of protection. A few days later, I was invited to her home. I knew for a fact that she had a big family. I'd seen it on the posters around town back in her campaigning days. Still, as soon as I got to her house, I noticed something was off. The lawn wasn't cut, and there was only one car in the driveway. All the curtains were closed. As I parked my car, I saw Leslie standing in the doorway to greet me.
Sorry about the mess.
She said as I walked up to her.
I'm really counting on your discretion here.
She said it jokingly, but I had the feeling there was more to it. I just smiled back at her. Of course, Leslie. She showed me inside, and my concerns grew. Stacked takeout boxes littered the living room, and there were at least 8 empty wine bottles on the kitchen counter. I found myself blowing away fruit flies every few seconds, and I didn't even want to know what lurked under the carpets.
I'll be honest.
She said.
It's been a rough couple of weeks.
I understand, I said, trying to keep a straight face.
I'm separating from my husband.
She sighed.
Not publicly, yet. But it's happening. The kids are staying with him.
That's rough.
Yeah,
She nodded.
rough.
I caught her eyes wandering off down the hall. She started walking, nodding for me to come along. We stopped outside the downstairs bedroom. A dry 4-leaf clover hung above the door. Some sort of childhood memorabilia. There was a flowery smell coming from the other side of the door, and I could hear a faint whooshing sound. Across the door was also the only new thing in this entire house. A sturdy bolt lock. It was installed to keep someone inside from coming out. That much was obvious.
I'll explain in a second.
She said.
Just be respectful.
Of course. The room was illuminated by nothing but a slit in the window. The room had a single window with some sort of metal sheet screwed across, allowing only a sliver of light inside. The room itself was sparsely decorated. Nothing but a queen-sized bed, a closet, an old mirror, and a bedside table. The whooshing sound was coming from a rotating ceiling fan, and the flowery smell was coming from the floor on the right side of the bed. Dozens of roses, so dry they were practically mummified. Still, it covered the room in a nice smell, covering up the smell of the one laying in the bed. Someone lying across from the old mirror, able to see themselves all the hours of the day. It was a very old man. He looked to be well past 90 years old, hairless, withered away, and barely breathing. There were no machines hooked up to him, no medication on the bedside table. Just closed eyes, shallow breaths, and practically no muscle left on his body. He stank of sweat and ammonia.
My dad, Oliver,
She said,
this is why you're here.
I think a nurse might be more appropriate. I'm not sure I can be of much use,
I don't need a nurse.
said Leslie, locking my eyes to hers.
I'm taking care of him. What I need is someone to make sure he and I are safe.
Are you expecting trouble?
All I need you to do is check in on him every 30 minutes or so. Be sure to turn on the light, or you won't see him breathing.
I'm sorry, but I need you to answer the question, I insisted. I can't help you if you're not telling me the full story,
He gets up sometimes.
sighed Leslie.
He gets up and he gets out, and he can get himself hurt.
This still sounds like the job for a nurse.
Do you want the job or not, Emmett?
She was dead serious. I wasn't sure about any of this, but I couldn't see any way I could say no. It seemed simple enough. I just nodded.
Good.
She smiled.
And remember to keep the door shut when you're not checking in on him. And if he starts knocking, just don't let him out. I'll deal with it when I get home.
I looked back on the door bolt. There was no way he was getting out without smashing the door or tearing the metal sheet off the window. And looking at those decrepit arms, I didn't expect that to happen any time soon. It became clear that Leslie just needed me during her off hours, while she was off at work. Apparently, she was having some sort of legal spat with a pharmaceutical company, and she had to work uncomfortable hours at times. I found it strange that I couldn't find anything about it in the local papers, and even stranger that she refused to talk about it. The only pharmaceutical company that even had a branch nearby had been shut down for decades. That first weekend with the elderly Oliver Boland was the worst. I was to come in every night from Thursday to Sunday, about 5 hours at a time. I did exactly as I was told. I put a chair in the hallway and made sure to check the room at least once every 30 minutes. Unbolt the door, turn on the lights, check for breathing. That was it, over and over. I got so bored out of my mind that I started bringing pocketbooks to read on my Saturday shift. I didn't even bother hiding it, and Leslie didn't seem to mind. Hours on end with nothing but a close to comatose old man and a whooshing ceiling fan can drive anyone insane. Then came Sunday afternoon. Leslie had just been gone for a little over an hour, and I was checking on Oliver for the second time of the day. As I turned on the lights, I recoiled. He was sitting up, staring straight ahead, into the mirror across the room. "Mr. Boland," I asked, "are you okay?" He didn't respond, didn't even look at me. He just leaned back into the bed and closed his eyes. There was something unnatural about the way he moved, almost mechanically. I made a note to tell Leslie about it when she got back. As I was leaving the room, I almost forgot to turn the lights off. As I reached the hallway, I turned around, only to see Oliver sitting upright again. But this time, he was looking at me. It felt predatory in a way, like he'd been caught in the act. I just turned off the lights and saw him lean back into the bed. It was the strangest thing. Even stranger was the roses by the bed. A few of them had turned blue. Leslie came back an hour later than expected, and wet as a dog. She was visibly stressed and seemed scared. She just pushed me out the door, mascara running from her eyes, and told me to come in extra the following day. I told her we should talk about Oliver, but she dismissed me.
I know.
She yelled.
Whatever it is, I know.
I started coming in 5 days a week, Thursday to Monday. It carried on for a little over a month, and I got pretty used to it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going to see him sitting up the next time I opened the door. He didn't, but it felt like there was always a chance. One night, Leslie was particularly late. I found myself dozing off, only to wake up when my book slipped out of my hands and hit the floor. I'd missed one of the 30-minute checkups. I bounced to my feet and hurried to the door. As I put my hand on the door bolt, I stopped, breathing. "Mr. Boland," I said, "are you up?" There was a short silence, then a footstep. A big one. Not two or several, just one big footstep. Something felt wrong, and I put my hand on my gun. I opened the door. There he was, sleeping as always. Had I imagined it? That night seemed to carry on forever. As it was getting close to 2 in the morning, Leslie was still nowhere to be found. I tried calling her, but I got nothing. Not on her cell, not on her office phone, nothing. I even thought about calling her husband, but decided against it. Instead, I just tried doing my job for as long as I could. At 2:30, I got up to do another check. As I put my hand on the door, something touched my face. I blew it away, thinking it was another fruit fly, when I noticed something touching my hand. A single, tiny blue leaf. Looking up above the door, I noticed the dried four-leaf clover had turned completely blue. I opened the door bolt and opened the door, only to have it stop against something. There was something heavy on the other side. 2 pushes later, and I realized it was the closet. How the hell did that old man move something that large and heavy without me noticing it? "Mr. Boland!" I yelled out. "I'm coming in!" Step by step, I pushed the door open. I got it to open just enough to see that his bed was empty, and that all the bedside roses had turned blue. Their leaves were scattered across the floor as if someone had stepped on them. I powered through and shoved the door open. Mr. Boland was standing in front of the metal sheet that covered the window. There was a loud pop as the corner screw was torn off. Mr. Boland was just standing there in the dark. The whooshing noise was gone, as the ceiling fan had gone quiet. The lights didn't work, and there were traces of glass spread across the bed. "Mr. Boland, His arms were to his side. He wasn't pulling on the metal sheet, but it was still moving. He turned around. His face was stretched to the limit, and something was coming out of his mouth. It was as thick as my arm, and twice as long. A dark, slick surface, like a kind of oil. It dripped onto the floor, leaving blue marks along the way. It was some kind of arm or tentacle. Before I got the chance to speak, the arm split in 4. One grabbed the mirror, one grabbed the bed, and the other 2 stuck to the ceiling. They started swinging forward, holding Oliver Boland like a macabre puppet. It was so fast. All those things moving towards me. Before I could get my gun out of my harness, he was already at the door. I stumbled backwards. The arms reached through the half-open door, only to get stuck by Oliver's frail body. It looked like a snail desperately trying to break free of its shell, or a snake trying to get loose from a bag. Right there in the middle of Oliver Boland's wide-open mouth, I saw something white flashing by, an eye or a set of teeth. My pulse didn't know what to do and just started racing. It got so high that I barely even felt it, and I was forgetting to breathe. I got my gun out, safety off, and put myself in a firing position. It was only then that I realized I had no idea what to fire at. What was my target? That moment of hesitation allowed the thing to close in on me. It threw itself at me, tossing Oliver like a rag doll across the room, knocking over the empty bottles, slipping as it lost grip on the hallway carpet. I just ducked, and as it went over me, we traded places. It was standing between me and the exit. I dashed upstairs, hearing the smattering of something sticky as the limbs scrambled to regain balance. It just seemed so eager to get to me, like it was hungry or playful. Rushing up the stairs, I took a shot. I didn't even know what to aim for, I just wanted it to stay away. I must have hit something. It was a good shot, but nothing happened. Just a large bang. I locked myself in the upstairs bathroom and backed away from the door. I heard some kind of squishy noise outside as tiny tentacles were reaching in from under and over the door. It was going to rip the entire door straight off the hinges. As the wood began to creak, I opened the bathroom window, knocking over decorative soaps and porcelain figurines. I was about to throw myself out when I felt something tugging at my leg. I didn't look back, but the smell of ammonia was overwhelming. And in the midst of panic, a voice somewhere deep inside Oliver Boland.
Hello?
Tried to pull me back. I held onto the window frame for dear life. As my shoe slipped off, I took my chance. I just fell from the second-story window, landing hard on the garage roof. I made big dent in the steel roof, tumbled off, and found myself flat on a gravel path, fresh out of breath. I pulled my shoulder and banged my head, but there was too much adrenaline for me to notice. I stumbled out to my car, threw myself in the driver's seat, and turned the key. As the headlights lit up, I saw Oliver Boland in front of my car. He was being held up by at least 6 appendages, standing like a crab in the middle of the driveway. His eyes were flickering back and forth, like he was dreaming. As I put the car in reverse, I noticed I was screaming. I hadn't even noticed that I'd started. I was just screaming my heart out, and it wasn't even a conscious decision. I just had to get away, no matter the cost. I don't know if it chased me or if it just let me leave. I don't know what happened for the rest of that night. I just pushed down on the gas and put as much distance as I could between me and that godforsaken house. The next day, I found myself 2 towns over. With my left foot bare, I stopped at a gas station and asked to borrow their phone. I must have dropped mine somewhere during the chase. Probably when I pulled my gun. I still couldn't get a hold of Leslie, and at that point, I didn't know what to do. The whole night felt surreal, like something that had never really happened. Later that day, as I was driving back home, I heard it on the news. Leslie Bolin had gone missing. I just shut up about the whole thing. The pay Leslie had given me had been a bit hush-hush and under the table, and I didn't want to risk ever coming near that house again, for any reason. Besides, what if I'd accidentally shot Mr. Bolin that night? What if I'd just hallucinated? It would be comforting to imagine not having seen what I'd seen, but no, it happened. Not that long afterwards, I heard the reports that Leslie Bolin had been found dead. I think I have an idea of what killed her. I didn't earn much during my time with Leslie Bolin. I've earned enough to scrape by as I look for another job, and I get to enjoy what time I have left with my mom. She is getting progressively worse. I've spent most of my days caring for her in my home. And just a few days ago, the strangest thing happened. My aunt came by to visit my mom. We all had some coffee and cake, talked, watched movies, and spent the day together. Later that night, as my mom had fallen asleep, I noticed something on her bedside table. My aunt had brought her a vase full of tulips, beautiful red and golden flowers, her favorite colors.
Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a man seeking therapy during COVID lockdown finds himself being manipulated by the person he's seeking help from. So, what would you do if he wasn't there to help?
I had a lot going on during the COVID pandemic. My dad passed away from an unrelated illness, and lockdown was driving me mad. I'd always been a bit paranoid, but being locked inside turned it all up to 11. My home was converted into a makeshift prison, an asylum where I was supposed to be my own caretaker. I didn't have much trouble switching to remote work. I usually worked exclusively with overseas clients anyway, so the only thing that really changed was the software, the chair, and my pre-rendered background. But as days turned to weeks, it became increasingly obvious that I wasn't okay. I'd sleep anywhere from 2 to 12 hours a night, and with no discernible pattern. I'd wake up crying without knowing why. Sometimes I couldn't even open the bathroom door, as I tricked myself into believing there might be someone on the other side. Having lost my dad, I was feeling more mortal than ever. The news, the internet, and the radio were all saying the same thing. Going outside was the end, and at that time in my life, I couldn't handle more death. Everything feels different when you're forced to stay inside. The walls seem closer, and your chest tightens. It feels like the air grows thinner, warmer. You can feel your breaths enter your lungs. They don't sustain you. Your knickknacks and doodads look like souvenirs from a place you can't go back to. A mockery, like notches on a prison wall. Sometimes when I slept, I'd forget what was going on. Waking up, the nightmare would fall on me like a rock, knocking the air out of my lungs. I'd grow increasingly scared of going to sleep, as if that rock would grow heavy enough to crush me. And yet, it was all better than going out there, among the others. I couldn't take a step outside my door. Even if the lockdown was to be lifted that same day, there was no way for me to convince myself that everything was going to be fine. Nothing was fine. And it wouldn't be for some time. My colleague, Dana, was the first to take notice. I'd been up for about 53 hours. She pulled me into a chat after a remote meeting, telling me I looked sick. I melted. I poured my heart out about anything and everything, barely forming a coherent sentence along the way. If someone asked me to recall what I said that day, I could only hazard a guess. Dana tried to understand, but must have realized this was above her pay grade,
I get it. It's a lot right now. It's a lot for all of us.
she said.
It might be time to talk to someone.
She reminded me that we had an agreement with one of our main partners, Hatchet Pharmaceuticals. They handled our health insurance, which also included mental health treatment. In fact, they'd expanded on it since the start of the pandemic,
They got a remote counseling program.
she said, holding up a brochure.
Just use your company login and sign up for a session. What do you think?
There wasn't much to say. I was willing to try anything. I filled out a questionnaire and got a response within a couple of hours. I was sent a link to a calendar app and got to pick a name from a list. There were a couple of short descriptions by each available counselor, giving me a bit of insight into what kind of person they were. There was a man named Gareth who had an empty calendar. It was strange. See, each counselor could be sorted by seniority and number of patients, and Gareth was at the top. He was, by a good margin, their most experienced employee. So how could his schedule be so empty? I signed up for a session with Gareth the next day. It felt like a stone settling in the pit of my stomach. I was nervous, and I didn't even know why. Maybe it was the prospect of a changing routine that scared me. Or maybe it was the thought of opening up to a stranger. Either way, it affected me way more than I thought it would. I went back and forth on canceling the whole thing. I wandered around like a cat on a hot tin roof, feeling the walls closing in. I ended up on the floor, gasping for air, curled up like a ball. I just wanted it to be over. I took a day off work to have my first session. It was just past lunchtime. I'd prepped a cup of Earl Grey and a microwaved cinnamon bun as comfort food, but that wouldn't stop my hands from shaking. I got a pop-up on my screen with a blue sunflower logo. Clicking that connect button felt like dipping my heart in ice water. Gareth popped up in a little video feed. He was a man in his late 50s with combed back salt and pepper hair. He had bushy eyebrows, a trimmed goatee, and a white shirt with a black tie. It looked like he was in a large office with wide open windows. It looked pleasant, airy.
Good afternoon.
He smiled.
I'm glad you could make it. It's difficult to take that first step on a new path.
It really is, I nodded.
But I'm glad you did.
He said.
Now how about we talk a little bit about who we are? Would that be all right?
We took turns talking about ourselves. We shared our names, our professions, our age, and a little bit about our families. Gareth was 57 years old and had worked as a mental health professional for 23 years. He had 2 sons who lived in Philadelphia, just like my mom. We spent some time talking about how we'd adapted to the pandemic and how we felt about having to stay inside, wear masks, and the way it affected the way we looked at other people. I barely noticed it, but Gareth had accidentally made me reveal my issues without me even realizing it. He was good, real good. I had told him about how difficult my life felt, that I felt trapped in my own home, but that the outside was even worse.
You're describing it like you're sailing a frying pan on a sea of fire.
Gareth said.
Like there's no way out. That must be stressful.
He was spot on. It felt hopeless, like spiraling down a black drain, but he just smiled and nodded.
We can work with this.
I decided to see Gareth twice a week. I could book any time I wanted. His calendar was wide open. I wanted to ask him about it, but I didn't. There was a part of me who didn't want to get too personal. Gareth seemed nice, but he was also just doing his job. I was asked to sit by an open window during work hours as an exercise, a way to get used to the sounds of the outside world. It was nerve-wracking. Every passing car felt like a freight train, and every stray voice from a passerby felt like a threat. But slowly, day by day, it turned to background noise. And with that, the world started to feel a little bigger. The walls breathed again. Over the next few sessions with Gareth, we tried a couple new exercises, leaving the window open when I slept, leaving the front door unlocked during work hours. And by our 4th session, he asked me to try something new.
About half an hour a day, right before you go to bed, I want you to open your front door.
He said.
Stand or sit there, taking in the sounds of the city.
That night, I tried it. I opened the front door and sat down. I tried to mentally record everything I saw, one thing at a time. The walkway down the road, the ill-kempt playground. I counted the cars, the windows on nearby buildings, the light posts, the parking meters. I put some conscious thought into observing things from a new perspective. But through it all, the one thing that made me want to go back inside was the sight of other people. It wasn't just the threat of a spreading pandemic. People seemed nefarious to me, ill-willed, dark silhouettes roaming about in the night, their wants and haves a mystery. If the news were an indicator of anything, everyone was struggling to make ends meet. Everyone was a potential assailant. At best, they were indifferent. Perhaps I had it all wrong. Maybe it wasn't the virus closing my throat that was the greatest issue. Maybe the real problem had been people all along. Looking at the nameless shapes staring at me from the windows across the street, that sentiment felt more true than ever. The more sessions I had with Gareth, the more I realized my priorities were changing. I was letting go of my claustrophobic tendencies, but I couldn't help but to feel threatened by the people around the neighborhood instead. Gareth seemed very interested in this, asking me to describe my feelings and mapping out my day. It was very thorough, and I got new exercises to deal with my anxieties. I was asked to record my nightmares and worries. Another day, I was asked to write down stray thoughts on paper. Another day, we had a session about how to practically deal with intruders and how it made me feel that there might be people out there who wanted to harm me. We talked about the many ways people could disappoint you and how easy it was to retreat from the public. But I didn't get a good read on Gareth. It seemed to me like he wasn't really trying to treat me anymore. The exercises he suggested did little but to zoom in on the worst feelings that lingered in the back of my mind. My anxieties were emphasized, not examined. But one thing that remained was my nightly routine to sit with an open door, looking out over the neighborhood. I'd stopped mapping the objects I could see. Instead, focusing on the neighbors, strangers walking past in the night. I had convinced myself that they wanted my money, my car, my brand name clothes, all of it. I had this feeling that if I were to leave my place for a night, I'd come back to it being ransacked if I came back at all. It was easier to just stay inside. One of those nights, however, I saw something. On the other side of the ruined playground, there were a series of row houses. One of the doors were left wide open. I could see the shape of someone standing in the doorway. I could have sworn they were looking straight at me. They didn't move. Were they trying to figure me out? Was this a warning? Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about this potential someone. It's as if I could see them everywhere, and Gareth wasn't helping. He was asking me to describe them, both physical attributes and their actions. It became a bit of a hyperfixation, and I couldn't stop myself from seeing them in the corner of my eye. But the fact was, something was happening out there. I'd see that same person every night, staring at me from across the street. I'd hear footsteps outside at night. Sometimes, when I slept, I swear I heard someone messing with my letterbox. It felt ridiculous, and I knew I was exaggerating, but was it really all make-believe? It was a Tuesday when, once again, I logged in to have a session with Gareth. The weather was rough, and some construction work had cut off my high-speed internet. I had to rely on spotty mobile Wi-Fi, and the approaching storm didn't help. Gareth connected, but it took a bit longer than usual. He had the same half-smile as always. I noted that he seemed to have good weather, which was a bit of a surprise. I thought he lived in the area.
Mr. Martin,
He said.
I'm glad you could join me.
I froze. I checked my webcam, making sure it was working properly. The resolution was a bit spotty, but there was no question about it. My face was clear enough. My name is not Martin. Not only should Gareth know that, but he could also see and hear me. It was very strange. I was caught off guard. Of course, I said. I wouldn't miss it. Gareth sat completely still, looking straight ahead. He was silent for almost a full minute, then sort of sprung to life. I thought that maybe the storm was interrupting the Wi-Fi, but it seemed to be working fine. Maybe there was an issue with Gareth's calendar app. Then again, if that was the case, how come he didn't recognize me?
Have you been keeping up with your exercises?
He asked. Yeah, I said, I have.
So let's hear it then.
He continued.
What did you learn?
About what? Gareth leaned back in his chair and chuckled. It was a warm sound, but there was something hollow in it. The screen froze, and in a heartbeat, he was back to leaning forward, looking straight into the camera.
About your target.
I barely had to say anything. This Martin person had come to Gareth for an issue similar to mine, something he had diagnosed as general anxiety disorder. It seemed like Gareth had poked and prodded Martin in a way that focused their issues on an external threat. Other people. A neighbor? I stood up, stepping away from my laptop, but leaving the conversation running. I peered out my living room window. What do you think I'll do to this neighbor? I asked.
We've talked about this.
Gareth responded. I know, I repeated. But I want to hear what you think.
I'm afraid you might murder them.
I looked back at the screen. Gareth just stared straight ahead, not moving a muscle. No emotion, just a matter-of-fact statement. I felt the moisture on my tongue evaporate as something sour crept up my throat. And what do you think about that, Gareth? I asked. He didn't blink. A full 20 seconds of silence passed. The only sound I could hear was my own heartbeat.
I think you're going to do what you need to do to heal,
He said.
And I want you to heal, Mr. Martin.
At any cost?
Of course.
There were a couple of people outside passing by in the night. Someone with a thick coat, another with a trucker cap, one with a backpack, another on their phone, some with their hands in their pockets, someone holding something dark, a gun, a knife. But no one stepped up to my door. No one came knocking. But there was someone standing in an open door on the other side of the playground, looking my way, like they'd done on so many other nights. Maybe they were making a difficult decision. The meeting with Gareth ran out of time, and I dove onto the net. My hands were shaking so much I could barely spell. I checked it all. The name of the program, the pharmaceutical company, Gareth. Everything and anything I could get my hands on. There wasn't much to see. Paper trails came to sudden ends. Names were scrubbed or removed. Most people working on the platform were hired as outside consultants, and there was no way to trace what kind of money they were moving or where. And Gareth, he was a puzzle piece. For everything he'd told me, none of it was specific enough for me to look up. There were no names of his children for me to track. No address where he lived. No mention of his previous place of employment. Running out of options, I called up my colleague Dana. It was 11 p.m., but I had to get answers. Dana was skeptical, but she could tell I was upset. She wasn't enthused about getting back in front of her computer, but I got her to look up a couple things. It didn't take long for her to find something curious.
Hatchet has a company policy about billable consultant hours.
She said.
They have a maximum number of billable hours. If someone goes past this, they need to be hired as a full-time employee.
How does that relate to their remote platform?
Gareth and a handful of others go way above this average. They ought to be full-time employees, but there's nothing that says they are.
So they're bending their own policy a little, so what?
There'd be a paper trail.
She continued.
We have a close association with them. We got access to their meeting protocols. Policy exemptions need to go through the board. So the only way I see it, there is only two ways to make sense of this.
She took off her glasses and leaned into her camera, lowering her voice.
Either this program is run illegally or these people don't exist.
I thanked Dana and got back online. There was no way I'd be sleeping that night anyway. A stray thought hit me, and I got back on the calendar app. Even now, in the middle of the night, Gareth was available. I booked an immediate meeting with him. That gave me an idea. Using my phone and a separate login, I checked his calendar again. According to it, he was free, despite me having booked that time already. So, I booked him again, 2 calls at the same time, and at the same time, a connect button popped up on my phone. I clicked both buttons at once. Gareth popped up with the same smile as always, sun shining from his open windows.
Good evening,
Said Gareth on my computer. Everything all right? Asked the Gareth on my phone. There were 2 of them. They were talking at the same time. I turned off my phone and leaned back. My pulse was rising. I had no idea what I was even looking at anymore. I'd been paranoid about people for weeks, maybe months, but there'd been a mystery in front of my face all along. "You're not real, are you?" I asked.
Of course I am.
He laughed.
I'm right here. Is this what you need to discuss? Are you having issues separating fantasy from reality?
"No," I spat back. "No, you don't get to do that. I'm not imagining this."
Then I don't know what to say.
He shrugged.
I'm as real as can be. I'm right here.
"Then how come you're saying two different things on two different screens, Gareth?" Gareth didn't answer. He looked off screen as if considering something. He looked back up at me, still smiling.
I'm sorry,
He said nothing.
but I have an urgent patient issue that I need to resolve.
My laptop shut off. Seconds later, my phone went black, and someone was coming up the stairs. Before my heart could skip a beat, something slammed into my front door. I raised my arms as if to shield myself from the sound, and a second later I heard the hinges buckle and snap. Then, something broke. Something splintered. I rushed to my kitchen, passing the entrance. There was someone standing by the broken door. I only saw them in passing, dressed in dark, ill-fitting clothes. I grabbed the first sharp thing I could get a hold of. Armed with a kitchen knife, I backed myself up against the wall, knocking over a few doodads in the window. It was a long way down, but if I had to, I'd rather have a shot at breaking a leg rather than dying. But I couldn't get the damn thing open. A stranger stepped into the hallway. About 6'3", dressed in a navy blue hoodie and a black leather jacket. Leather gloves curled around an honest-to-God machete. A face obscured by a burlap sack with holes poked out around wide-open green eyes. Shoulders heaving with excited breaths. He rushed forward, grabbed one of my kitchen chairs, and threw it across the room. It broke against the wall, knocking over a photo. Shattered glass covered the floor. Something whistled past my left shoulder and slammed into the kitchen tap with a metallic clang. It made my ears screech. I steadied myself against the kitchen table, and it was casually tossed aside with a crash. I headed straight for the door. For the first time in months, I didn't consider my anxieties. I had to get out. Then, something cold grabbed my neck. Leather gloves. I reached back with my kitchen knife, but lost my footing on the broken glass. I was sent tumbling to the ground, landing hard on my shoulder. I looked up to see a raised machete, and those sparkling green eyes. I had to say something. Anything. "Mr. Martin." It was the first thing that came to mind. The machete hung in the air, ready to fall. He hesitated. "You're Mr. Martin. You're speaking with Gareth, right?" There was no response, just excited, heaving breaths and a shaking machete, frozen in place like a living statue. "He's tricking you. United States. He's tricking us. He's not real, Mr. Martin. He's not real." Something clicked. A heavy boot stepped on my wrist, kicking my knife away. The machete crept closer, cold steel resting on my chin. I felt the warmth leave the tip of my fingers.
"I win.
A hoarse voice wheezed.
I got you first."
"I'm not playing any games." "I'm not." For the first time, he blinked. He tilted his head. I continued. "I'm not playing Mr. Martin. You can't be first if I'm not playing."
"You were trying to get me first."
"No, I wasn't."
"You're lying."
The tip of the machete pushed into my skin, shaving a couple of hairs and cutting a 2-inch gash across my jaw. Pain, like sharp ice, spread across my face. Then a noise. A loud electronic noise. My phone must have come back on. Martin stopped. He was having trouble hiding his glee. He was giggling like a schoolboy. And this was funny to him, if anything.
"Answer it.
He chuckled.
I want them to hear."
I took my phone out. It was Dana.
"Answer it."
He repeated.
"Put it on speaker."
So I did. Dana's voice came through. Something about what we'd talked about had kept her up as well. She had always been the kind of person who couldn't let go of a good mystery.
You gotta hear this.
She said, going straight into a rant.
I think I got something.
I held up the phone for Martin to hear as Dana explained her findings. It turned out the program wasn't supported by our healthcare deal. It was just registered as a support feature, and it was included in the same paperwork. It was never literally spelled out as a health service. Looking into the fine print, it was specified as a technical support feature.
You get it?
She laughed.
They're not a mental health care provider. They're hired to handle data collection.
What? I whispered.
They're gathering data. That's their primary function. Data like mental health problems, stress-related issues, ages, locations, trends, dreams, wants.
Or how fast they can get us to kill one another. Dana laughed. I looked up at Martin. He wasn't laughing. The machete pierced my phone as he flicked it across the floor. His eyes sunk. He didn't look as excited anymore. His shoulders slumped with a loud sigh.
You're not playing.
He wheezed. No, I'm not. He took his foot off my arm. I could feel the warmth running back into my fingertips. With the casual stroll of someone heading to the supermarket, he headed for the exit. Without looking back, he shared a few parting words.
I would have won.
Over the next few days, we lost access to the program. Dana and I couldn't do or say anything. Turns out they had baked more than we'd anticipated into the terms of service. It explicitly stated that it was an experimental service and wasn't to be used as a substitute for conventional mental health care. It was all just data collection. Some artificial program meant to get people talking, engaging them and pushing them to tell them more and more and more. Not aiming to help them or guide them, but to get them to return talk and stay engaged with the platform. And this Martin guy? Turns out there was no neighbor with that name. There was, however, a man who'd been found dead in the row house across the street, slashed to pieces and kept in plastic bags in a bathtub. Someone had been squatting there since the beginning of the pandemic. Someone who the neighbors described as a strange man with bright green eyes. I think Gareth was just keeping this murderer engaged, poking him to go further, to do more, and to stay occupied. I don't think it was a conscious decision. It was just algorithms. Oddly enough, I think my paranoid tendencies have eased. As the pandemic came to an end, I figure something as absurd as this whole thing won't happen to the same person twice. No matter what I run into out there, I don't think it's going to be another killer. It's freeing in a way. If I can survive this, I can survive